In this video, we will show you how to replace your power steering rack bellows boot on this Ford Explorer. This will be located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friends, let's get started on our job. The first thing you want to do is safely raise and support the front of your vehicle so the wheel's off the ground with the suspension hanging. Once you've done that, continue on to removing all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that we have the wheel off, we have a nice clear view of our outer and inner tie rod end. In between the two, you're going to find a 21mm jam nut. We'll use our 21mm wrench, get onto this, and try to turn it clockwise to break it free. Once you have movement from that area, continue on to your 21mm tie rod nut. There we are. Now we'll separate the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. Sometimes it'll fall right out of there, other times it requires a couple loving bonks. Now we can start unscrewing the outer tie rod end from the inner tie rod end. When you do this, it's always a good idea to make sure you count the amount of turns it takes to remove it. 1, 2, and so on. There it is, friends. Now that we have the outer tie rod end out of the way, we'll continue on to fully removing the jam nut. To do that, hold onto the inner tie rod end with some locking pliers and use a 21mm socket to remove that jam nut. Now we can follow that inner tie rod end into the bellows boot. On the bellows boot, you'll find that you have 2 clamps holding it in place. One holding it to the inner tie rod end, and the inboard one is holding the bellows boot to the rack. We'll remove that outboard clamp using some long nose pliers. Give it a quick inspection and set that aside. Now let's use a pry bar and follow that bellows boot all the way to where it connects onto the power steering rack. Down in this area is where you're going to find the mounting clamp. To remove this clamp, we'll use the pry bar and a hammer, and we're going to break it free. This clamp is a single-time use clamp. There's the edge that I grabbed onto with the pry bar, and then I broke it free. We'll set this aside for recycling. With both of those clamps off of there, we can start removing the bellows boot. It's common to find that the bellows boot is stuck on the inner tie rod end on the outer aspect right here. Use a small pick with a little bit of penetrant and separate it. Once you have, you can remove that boot. Now we can take hold of that bellows boot, give it a little twist, and pull it off of the inner tie rod end. Now we can get ready to install our bellows boot. On the inboard side, which is the wider end, we'll use a wire tie. Put this right on there. Now we can take this and slide it over the inner tie rod end, all the way up and over the power steering rack. Once you feel as though you have that properly in place, tighten your wire tie and trim the end. We'll use some long pliers for this to pull up the slack. cutters to trim the end. Make sure that's secured to the power steering rack. Continue on with your outer clamp. Now we can continue on with our outer clamp. We'll use some long nose pliers, give this a quick squeeze, and slide it into place. Make sure that's secured. Now we can use some anti-seize along the threaded area of the inner tie rod end. Let's install the jam nut. We'll put this on approximately 3/4 of the way down the inner tie rod end. Now the next thing we're going to do is clean and inspect the threaded area on the inner tie rod end. Assuming the threads look good, continue on with some copper anti-seize. Now we can install our outer tie rod end. When we go to put this in position, make sure you put it on the same amount of threads as it took to remove it in the first place. One, two, and so on. Now we can take that outer tie rod end and put it in place into the steering knuckle. Continue with your outer tie rod end nut. To tighten this, we'll use a 21 millimeter. Once it's snug, torque it to 111 foot-pounds. Continue on to your jam nut. We'll bottom this out against the outer tie rod end and then snug it up. To tighten this, use a 21 millimeter on the nut and a 1-inch wrench to hold the outer tie rod end. You want to make sure that jam nut is nice and tight, otherwise your steering could potentially loosen up on you. All right, at this point we can reinstall our wheel. We'll start on each one of our 19 millimeter lug nuts, snug them up, get the wheel back on the ground, and then torque them to 100 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely back on the ground, we'll torque each of these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. All right, friends, the vehicle is back together. At this point, you can go ahead and hop inside the passenger compartment and take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.